My name is Brian Corr. I live in Cambridge. I don't live in Ward 5. I actually live in Ward 6, so I am not in the district, so I hope to be completely unbiased. Thank you all for being here this evening. We will start on my left. Mr. Dawson, if you could
Thank you,
please
Brian.
introduce yourself.
My name is Josh Dawson, and I believe I should be your next state representative for the 8th Suffolk District. Been knocking on doors since the end of February, and it's so fitting that I'm in Cambridge knocking on doors. When I moved to Massachusetts with about $721 in my pocket, a place to stay for a few months, and didn't have a job, but I knew Greater Boston was where I wanted to be. My first real job was with the Sapient Corporation, and at the time was located on First Street, where I became a project manager and managed a team that was based here in Cambridge, but was in London and Munich and Delhi, and even worked in Delhi, India for a time, for a month, managing the team. After that, I got involved with local politics in Boston and became chairman of the Boston Ward 5 Democratic Committee. I worked as legislative and budget director for State Senator Tom Kennedy. And then after that, when Steve Grossman was elected treasurer in 2010, he asked me to manage his political committee, which I've done for the last 2 years. At the end of February, Steve and I had a chat as friends, because that's the type of person Steve is. And he said, "I love you, Josh. Now get the heck out of here and go knock on some doors." And that's what I've been doing since the end of February. My work in the legislature, I think, is really what sets me apart in this race. I have experience working on progressive pieces of legislation, most notably when Senator Ted Kennedy passed away, and it was important for Massachusetts to have full representation in Washington, D.C. I was the point person for the interim succession bill, which allowed for Paul Kirk to be appointed U.S. Senator and allowed for Massachusetts to have full representation in Washington, D.C. during the health care debate. We can get into other things, but I'm newly married. My wife and I live on Beacon Street in the Back Bay. We plan to raise our family here in Greater Boston, and it's my job as state representative to continually make Greater Boston, Cambridge, and Boston the best place in which to live, work, raise a family, start a business, and educate our children. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Josh.
My name is Jay Livingstone, and I'm running as a Democrat for state representative. And I'm running because I want to make a difference. And the way I want to make a difference, I want stronger public schools, restoring money to social programs that have been drastically cut, improving public transportation infrastructure, and smart development. These are all issues that I've worked on for years. I've been a lawyer for 15 years. I've been a neighborhood leader and a progressive activist. I've been a progressive activist in my neighborhood. I live in Boston and organizing downtown Boston for progressive leaders like Deval Patrick and Elizabeth Warren. Campaigns that I was proud of. And a neighborhood leader. I'm on the board of directors of the Beacon Hill Civic Association, and I've been clerk of the Zoning and Licensing Committee, volunteering my time to represent the neighborhood in neighborhood interests with respect to all zoning and licensing matters. And, I work hard, and this is the part of speech I always have the trouble with, because I don't like bragging about myself. But lately I've had a lot of acknowledgments, and it's been great to hear. People acknowledging my progressive values, the conviction, and my prior work experience. And those progressive organizations such as Mass Alliance, the Sierra Club, the National Organization of Women, the National Association of Social Workers, have all endorsed me. But the endorsement I'm most proud of is I was also, like Josh, an officer of the Ward 5 Democratic Committee. And 2 nights ago, the people that knew us both the best, the Ward 5 Democratic Committee in Boston, endorsed me. And that's the one that meant the most, because those are the people that have worked with both of us for years. And I was honored to receive their endorsement. No one will work harder than I will to earn your support. No one will listen more closely to your concerns, and no one will fight harder than I will on Beacon Hill for our progressive values. And I appreciate you coming out tonight, and I would appreciate your vote on May 28th. Thank you.
Thank you both. So now that I've stop jumping ahead. I will go back to the first question, and we'll go to Jay for the first question first. And this question is about taxation. So in his State of the Commonwealth address in January, Governor Deval Patrick proposed raising revenue for infrastructure and education by increasing the income tax while cutting the sales tax. As the legislature develops its budget this week, both houses seem prepared to adopt a budget lacking the major investments in education sought by the governor, but have committed to $500 million in new tobacco, gas, and business taxes, supporting new spending on transportation, and to avoid increasing MBTA fares. So this is the question. And it's a three-part question, so if you want to write this down, feel free.
Not 4?
Nope, just 3. And again, you will have just 2 or 3 minutes to answer, so. First,
Each part or?
the whole thing.
Okay.
So first, where do you stand on the governor's original package and the House and Senate responses? Second, what do you see as the right balance between taxation and spending? And third, what would be your priority for the budget to address areas that are not currently receiving the necessary funds in the state budget over the next 2 fiscal years? So Jay, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Brian. I like what the governor tried to do. Our Commonwealth is facing significant deficiencies with respect to public transportation and education. And we need to make significant investments in those. And there isn't room in the budget to shift around money. And the governor boldly talked about a significant tax increase to raise the necessary revenues to meet those pressing needs. And I supported that. The way the governor raised the money was the way that I would want to raise money, which is progressively. So that those who can afford to pay a little more do, those who can't don't. Under the governor's proposal, if you were earning $40,000 a year, you wouldn't pay anything more. If you were earning $100,000 a year, they estimated you'd pay $25 more a month. Only those that could afford to pay more would. The House response, which was to not fund education, was and to not fund the public transportation needs to the level that is necessary for our economic future, was disappointing. So the next one is the balance between tax and spending. You always have to be careful whenever you're raising revenue that you don't overtax the population. But with the governor's spending of infrastructure and education, that would have spurred more economic growth. The governor had 57 economists look at his proposal, and all of them said that doing the governor's proposal would have caused economic expansion. Those are the right type of investments to make with our money, and I would have been proud to stand with the governor. And in fact, when the governor first announced it, I went to the State House at a rally and did stand with the governor. The one disappointment that I had with the governor's proposal was social spending, particularly social programs. I worked down the street in the Middlesex DA's office, and I saw kids slipping through the cracks on a daily basis. And as soon as the budget cuts started happening 3 years ago, one of the agencies targeted was the Department of Children and Families, and the situation was made significantly worse, where kids couldn't get into programs that they previously could get into, or weren't getting the help that they needed. We need to make sure that we invest in our future, and investing in social services, education, and public transportation is exactly what we should do, and that's how I want our tax revenue spent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. So Josh, same set of questions.
That's a great question. The governor's plan was, to me, very adequate for the times, and in particular, many of the folks in the room who live in the neighborhood, or if you're watching at home, you have probably more than once either saw my literature or heard me speak on your doorstep about our need to invest in education, our transportation and infrastructure, and our innovation economy. I think the governor's plan was very bold in addressing those three issues, particularly in the transportation infrastructure sector. And this really hits home with me. Lindsay and I live 2 blocks from the Heinz stop in the Back Bay. In an ideal world, Lindsay would be able to grab her coffee and a newspaper in the morning and get to the Ainger Elementary School where she works in Waubun. That's not the case because some days it's 45 minutes, some days. And because she works with children on IEPs every day, if she's late to work by 15, 20 minutes, that's a kid's services for that week. And we're talking about children on the autism spectrum. Missing a week of services at a very young age is crucial. So our transportation infrastructure is key. If we do not invest in that, fully fund our MBTA structure, the ride fares are going to continue to have double-digit increase every year, unpredictable increases. The Green Line, which a lot of folks in the Back Bay ride every day, 60% of people living in the Back Bay area walk, ride their bike, or take public transportation to work. I would assume that that number is pretty similar throughout the 8th Suffolk District. Next, the education plan by the governor was phenomenal. It invested in pre-K services, so children who are between the ages of 3 and 5, most of whom do not live in an environment or a family that would allow for them to have that pre-K services that they need to compete once they get to kindergarten. And Lindsay told me that when those children who do not receive those types of services get to kindergarten, we pay for it anyways because they need the extra help to get ahead. That whole year of kindergarten usually takes them to get ahead. So the governor's plan was great in addressing pre-K services. I'm a product of a public school. I believe strongly in the public school system. I think regardless of whether you grow up in Cambridgeport, in Beacon Hill, or Eggleston Square, you should have access to a local, high-quality public school. That is a right and not a privilege. And then lastly, our tax and spending. We need to raise revenue. I'm 30 years old. I'm not saying I'm old or young, but most of the orange and red line trains are older than I am. I think we need to do something about that. We haven't invested in our transportation infrastructure since the 60s and 70s. And then lastly, priorities for our community, transportation infrastructure, education, the social services, programs like Turning 22, we need to fully fund. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Aftermath of the bombings at the Boston Marathon and what happened in the wake of those. So this question will start with Jay, but here's the question. In the wake of the Boston Marathon bombings and the tragic events that followed in and around this district, touching so many lives, many in Cambridge and Boston are deeply concerned about a range of issues: public safety, civil liberties, trauma and recovery, and the meaning and implications of diversity and inclusion in our communities. So please share with us one legislative priority or issue and one policy priority or issue that you believe must be addressed in the wake of these events, and what you think the long-term implications are of these bombings and these events for our district.
It was unthinkable what happened last week. We always hear, every night on the news, you can see terrorist attack happen. But this happened right in our district, right in our home. And it was shocking. But it hasn't been surprising, and it's been great the way the community has come together. The peace vigil that Josh referred to, there was a peace vigil the night before in Boston. In both events, bringing the community together, people supporting each other. And that's what makes these neighborhoods great. And as people examine how these kids that grew up not far from here could make such poor decisions and tragic decisions, it goes back for me to when I was a juvenile prosecutor. And you need to put the resources in at the front end to avoid results at later in life. And I saw kids that were on the cusp of what direction were they going to go in life. Were they going to become productive members of society, or were they going to go down a different path? And when the kids had the structures, when they had support from for instance, DCF, from their schools, from after-school programs, from the cities. They could succeed. They were given the tools that they needed to succeed, and they, even if they put one foot in the wrong path, they ended up in the right path. That's why I think it's so crucial that we restore the funding that's been cut in social services the last few years. And as a legislator, that would be one of my top priorities.
I spent that afternoon and that evening housing 3 students from the University of New Hampshire who traveled down to Boston that day to provide care for the runners after they finished. I think the folks investigating what happened have the best answers right now, and I don't want to speculate on what may have caused the 2 young men allegedly to have committed these heinous acts on very peaceful people in an international crowd. This wasn't a Boston event. This affected the world. But what I do know is, again, from speaking with Lindsay and then also talking to Treasurer Grossman, whose 8-year-old son has realized that the kid was 8 years old who passed away in this attack. I think we need to make sure that trauma services for young children are there, especially during these times, because we will likely experience events that could be very traumatizing towards young kids. So I want to make sure that we have those services in place, ready to go. Our school districts do a phenomenal job of these trauma care right now, but I want to make sure they have every tool available in an event of another emergency. But secondly, and this morning I announced the endorsement by the professional firefighters of Massachusetts, the Cambridge firefighters, and the Boston firefighters. They recognize that I am somebody with the legislative experience to understand what firefighters and first responders go through on a day-to-day basis. How many stories did you hear or even read about in the Boston Globe? Firefighters who were just spectators that day and ran around the corner to the next ladder and grabbed some equipment and helped people out. We need to make sure that those who put themselves on the line every day for us as citizens have the health care and every resource available to do their job effectively on a day-to-day basis. And I will not waver in my commitment to fulfill the needs of the folks who put their lives on the line every day for us as citizens.
So as I'm sure you know, there is a proposal to allow the global oil company to transport ethanol by train across a large portion of Massachusetts, including Cambridgeport and East Cambridge. Mass DOT maintains that these trains are safe enough to travel through our community. There has been much opposition to the proposal from communities and elected officials because of safety in the case of leaks, spills, or an accident, as well as concerns about the challenges caused by the increase in the number of long trains using at-grade crossings in Cambridge. So the question is this: what is your position on transporting ethanol through Cambridge by train, and what would you do as a state representative to address concerns regarding these plans? So we'll start with you, Josh.
Thanks, Brian. The company that wants to do this is a Fortune 500 company. They currently ship this product on a barge, I believe from Providence or somewhere in Rhode Island, up to Revere. I think they're doing quite well and can afford not to use the rail system to transport what is a highly flammable liquid. Our first responders, I don't know if they have the equipment to deal with a disaster if it were to happen. I adamantly oppose this and will work with our elected officials in Cambridge and Boston and Chelsea and Somerville and Revere and Everett. I was on the phone with my friend who is a Chelsea city councilor this morning. They're doing everything they can to stop this. And what really hit home with my friend Matt was that the so-called, if there were to be an explosion in Chelsea, the fallout shelters are elementary schools which are in this zone. So I don't know if we can, there was in Illinois in 2011, one of these trains derailed and a community of 780 people had to be evacuated. I don't know about you, but evacuating Somerville, Chelsea, Boston, that might be a little difficult of a task. We do not need these trains going in. This company is doing quite well. Global Petroleum, I believe is the name of the company. I will fight with the elected officials who are already fighting this and make sure that, as I understand it, this is really going to be a federal issue. So we need to communicate to the folks like Mike Capuano and Elizabeth Warren, Mo Cowan, to make sure, and I'm sure they're already working on this and doing the best that they can. They're fine individuals that work tirelessly on our behalves every day. But I want to be in that fight with them to oppose this. I'm a former boxer, amateur boxer, and I know how to put up a fight, and I'm not going to back down from this one.
Thank you, Josh. Jay?
Thank you. I strongly oppose this. It is never a good idea to have highly dangerous materials travel through densely populated residential areas. And that's what the proposal is. It currently goes by boat. It does go from Providence to Revere. And that should be what continues. The other night, there was a public hearing in Cambridgeport on this exact issue. Unfortunately, I couldn't go because it was the night after the bombing, and I was at a vigil in Boston. But this is an important issue, and I was excited when the hearing was online. And so the next morning, that's what I listened to. And it was discouraging. It was encouraging to hear every Cambridge elected official speak at that hearing, voicing their opposition and inviting the public to do the same, and saying how this was a federal issue. The state decision makers couldn't stop it, but that they were lobbying their legislators, and they invited all the public to do the same. And I would join that chorus. I've fought against the federal government before. I've represented state government against the federal government as a lawyer. It can be difficult, but it can be done. And there's different tactics to use. Often, persuasion is the best, but the more voices that are heard, the more likely you get the results you want. It reminds me also, on a smaller scale, of my work on Beacon Hill for the Civic Association. Often, we have developments happen, and people come in and they want to do things that are going to ruin the lives for everybody around them. And sometimes they hire somebody that knows is connected with the local government. And all of a sudden you get pressure. But and I had one of these in December, where somebody did exactly that. And what I did was rounded up all the neighbors, other advocate groups, and got together and went before the city and presented a unified front. And at that point, we got the result that we wanted, which was a slowed down process until people could figure out what they were doing. I view this fight with the federal government the same. The more voices that are heard on this, the more strongly, the better. And as a state rep, I would oppose this, and I invite all of you to contact your local official to do exactly that, because we could also use these train tracks as bike paths, which would be much more productive for the area. Thank you.
Thank you. So the last question that I have for you before we open it up to the audience is around public employees and unions. And again, we'll start with Josh and go to Jay. So over the last 2 years, a number of states have restricted and reduced the right to bargain collectively for state and municipal employees, including my home state of Michigan. One of the current candidates for U.S. Senate, State Senator Dan Winslow, introduced so-called right-to-work legislation in Massachusetts. So the question is this: what is your position on the role of public unions, on the level of benefits they receive generally as compared to the private and nonprofit sectors? And then what would be your focus on these issues as a state representative?
Well, I'm blessed to have support from unions in this race, and I'm the son of a member of the United Steelworkers Union in Ohio. I'm the grandson of not only a D-Day veteran, but a union carpenter. My other grandfather, after serving in the Marine Corps during the Korean War, used the GI Bill, a government benefit, to do some trade skilled work, and was a union UAW factory machinist his whole career. to say unions have put food on the table, working class families have put food on the table for me is an understatement. I believe strongly that not only is collective bargaining a right, but it's something that every public employee should have access to. Public employees are on the front lines, and many of them do God's work on a day-to-day basis and are not compensated appropriately. As a former public employee, I was a legislative and budget director in the state Senate. I was not a member of the union, but worked with many public employee unions on a day-to-day basis. There will be an open door in my office for anybody who would like to come in and chat, but especially folks who really do God's work on a day-to-day basis for our Commonwealth. The benefits they receive, yesterday, Jay and I were interviewed with the Mass Teachers Association and talked about how teachers who receive pensions, they pay for those pensions they receive. So we need to make sure that we do everything we can to protect those pensions that they are receiving from the legislature grabbing them and paying for projects down the line. It's why our pension system is underfunded right now. One of the many reasons why it's underfunded right now. So the focus as it relates to unions, in the mornings when I go on a jog, I put on my dad's United Steelworkers shirt from 2010 when the referendum happened in Ohio to defeat, I think it was issue 2. Which was the same thing that happened in Wisconsin, but it had more teeth in it. However, Wisconsin got all the notoriety because it was the first one in the nation. Trust me, Governor Kasich in Ohio is bad for Ohio, and none of his policies belong in Massachusetts. Our public unions are on the front lines protecting the middle class. And the reason Greater Boston is such a great place to live and work is because we have a vibrant middle class that contributes to the diversity of our communities. Thank you. Jay?
Thank you. Unions play an important role, and they have in the history of the United States, in developing the middle class. Similar to Josh's family, my family, it's the same. Both my grandparents were union members. My mother was a school teacher and union member. I myself, one of my first jobs was at Stop and Shop and became a union member, and then worked in a factory in Mansfield where I was a union member. In my legal career, one of the first legal jobs I had was working in an international union. And I also have been blessed with the endorsement of county, state, or the city of Boston employees. The 10 local Boston unions have asked me, where I have my campaign headquarters in downtown Boston. And the right to collective bargaining and the effect that has on people cannot be overstated. In my law practice, I represent people that have been discriminated against at work and typically wrongfully terminated. And when I receive a call from somebody who says that they've faced this situation, the first question that I ask is if they're in a union. Because the answer to that question determines how many rights they have. And I've represented union members where their employers tried to terminate them. And the employer had to prove just cause, which is very different from everybody else. And the effect that has, where people can do their job and not have to worry about the arbitrary decisions of their employer, is crucial to people maintaining a good quality of life and having good quality jobs. So I fully support unions because I see the effects of being in a union and out of a union for employees on a daily basis in my law practice. And as a legislator, I would support the right to collective bargaining and would never do anything to undermine that. And with respect to benefits, the union members often people complain about their pensions or other benefits, but the salaries are typically below what the private sector is paying. And the And that's the trade-off that they're making in collective bargaining. The members are bargaining for those rights, and they should be able to have the full benefit of those rights. And I would work to protect those as a legislator.
So, please come.
Gentlemen, my name is Dave. I'd like to ask a question about state-owned banking. A couple of years ago, the legislature and the governor set up a commission to study the feasibility of a state bank in Massachusetts. They asked the commission to focus on the Bank of North Dakota, the only state bank in the country, which has been very successful over almost a century in reducing taxation, obtained a report from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, which, as you know, is a collection of 3,000 private banks. Would you support a state-owned Bank of Massachusetts?
We all know that during the worst economic times we've faced in roughly 70-some years, when credit was frozen and the big banks were hoarding all their cash, waiting to see how bad it was going to get, who stepped in? It was the small local community banks. When you see the Little League teams and the Pee Wee jerseys, the names on the back of those are the small local community banks. They stepped in and really provided the lending to the small business sector of our economy when it was desperately needed. 85% of people in Massachusetts are employed by a small business. I think we need to do everything we can to support local small community banks. Our committee banks with a local community bank in the Back Bay. And one thing, Dave, did you ever speak with Treasurer Grossman on the phone about this?
No, I haven't.
Okay, because I do recall him speaking with an individual about this often. This is an issue I would love to explore more. I think when the public can pool their money together and have a say in that's why credit unions are so great. The people who have their money in those banks have a say in what the bank does with those funds. One thing, I mean, when Steve Grossman was running for state treasurer, he was labeled this activist treasurer, right? What did that mean? Well, he was a progressive, just like I am. He said that, okay, where is the state deposits right now? They're sitting in mutual funds, money market funds. They were sitting overseas in Luxembourg and Sweden, chasing a little bit more yield. So he created what I thought was one of the best pieces of legislation to happen in the last 4 to 5 years with Garrett Bradley, the Small Business Banking Partnership, that brought that money from overseas into our local community banks, over $300 million worth. I think community banking is where we need to go, and I like your idea and would love to work with you on that.
All right, that's time. Jay?
I think it's a great idea. And it's very important where we place our money. And I was just speaking the other day at a breakfast at Mass Alliance and with Senator Wolf. Senator Wolf is a progressive senator from the Cape. And he said he sat on the board of 2 banks. And one bank both were local banks, but one bank was in the process of selling to a national bank. The other bank was just operating as a local entity and was owned by its depositors. And he said when he sat on the boards of both, he saw that the ownership was directly impacting the decision making. And a bank that is owned by the public, that is only operating in the public's interest, I think would be a great thing. Because Josh is right that small banks did lend more in the financial crisis than larger banks. But the key was the federal government stepped in. The federal government was the one that started getting lending going. And without that government intervention, none of the banks would have continued to lend. The government is the only entity that will invest in our community even in bad times, even when we need it the most, when it looks the riskiest. And a community bank that would only operate in the best interests of the community, I think is a great idea.
All right. Thank you.
It's a great question.
Please come up to the mic.
My name's Lester Sackett, and my wife is a social worker, and she got the notification from the National Association of Social Workers that you got their endorsement, and I'm just wondering why you think you got it, and Josh, why you didn't, and do you in fact have any differences in your opinions that might have led to that?
All right. We'll start with Jay.
I was honored to receive the endorsement of the National Association of Social Workers. And why they made that decision, you'd really have to ask them. One of the things that I think distinguished us and was unique in my background is my experience, is what I saw in juvenile court was the direct effect that social workers had in helping at-risk kids get on the right track. And that the drastic cuts that the state has done for the Department of Children and Family in particular has had, I saw the effect where police officers would say, this kid was getting help and now they're not, and now they're getting in trouble. And it's wasteful. And if I'm elected, I would work to fix that, because it's key. Every kid should have the opportunity to reach their full potential, and that's what I've worked towards.
Thank you.
Lester, and that was a great question. I'm sure Jay enjoyed you asking that also.
I appreciate it.
No, I worked with social workers, even though I was a legislative and budget director in the state senate. The state senator for whom I worked represented the Brockton area. And so our constituents director, his caseload, there's no way he could have kept up with it on a day-to-day basis. So we all had about 4 to 6 cases that we would work on at a time. A lot of times he worked with social workers who sometimes were going into some very, very dangerous situations following when police officers would arrive on the scene. Social workers are those folks I talked about earlier who do God's work on a day-to-day basis. They're a part of the public employees who should be compensated appropriately for the dangerous work that they sometimes do. And a friend of mine, Josh, his sister is in graduate school right now at BU to become a social worker. You have to go to a great school to get a job as a social worker in Greater Boston. And those schools are not cheap. And social workers do not make a ton of money. And so what I would like to do as a state representative is making sure that we have the loan forgiveness programs and the pension programs that reflect the dangerous work that they do on a day-to-day basis. What I'm saying is that they should be in a certain group retirement plan along with police officers and other firefighters that have to do the work of first responders. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I would have been honored to have their support too, but I couldn't tell you why they did.
Okay, in the back, please, or the middle of the back. Yes, please.
Good evening.
Hello.
My name is Amanda, and my question for you is this. Right now, as you probably know, there's legislation that's been introduced by Senator Feingold and Representative Holmes that would lift and in some cases eliminate the charter school cap in Massachusetts. Would love to know your thoughts on that. Would you support it or would you not support it?
So we'll start with you, Josh.
Okay, it's a great question, Amanda. Probably the best piece of legislation and the legacy, and talking about the legacy of this particular state representative seat, is it was held by Marty Waltz, most recently, who championed the 2010 education reform bill. It also was represented by Mark Roosevelt, who was the last person to sponsor the education reform bill in Massachusetts. So there's a legacy about this seat in education policy. I'm not an expert in education policy, but I'm working very hard to try to be. I think the 2010 law is too new. We're still trying to gauge how effective it was, especially as it relates to the charter school caps. I would not be inclined, and I will not support lifting that cap on charter schools. I believe in good, high-quality public schools, and that's what I will advocate for. There are issues with charter schools that I have, especially around collective bargaining rights for teachers employed by those schools. And I can also tell you that with charter schools, if you're not, they need to receive an adequate amount of funding for who they see on a day-to-day basis. The schools outside of the charter school system that see the children with special needs on a day-to-day basis need to be compensated appropriately. So at this time, I would advocate not to lift the charter school cap. We need more time to see how effective the 2010 legislation was, making sure our numbers are good before making a decision on that.
Great, thank you. Jay?
I wouldn't support lifting the cap. The charter schools the number of charter schools in Massachusetts right now is below the cap. And so there isn't a need to lift the cap at this point. But also, there's other reasons not to. There's one of the things I liked about Marty Wall's legislation in 2010 was it tried to introduce charter schools in a different way. The history of charter schools was to people trying to do things completely outside of the public school system. Sometimes that was driven by avoiding the union members, which were the teachers. Other times it was for innovation. With the 2010, one of the things that the 2010 bill did was it allowed the innovation that could come from charter schools to happen within union membership schools and within school districts. And we're still seeing how that played out. And so I wouldn't want to do anything, particularly right now. We're 3 years in from that bill, with additional charter schools without fully realizing whatever benefits we can from the 2010 legislation. But myself, I grew up in North Attleboro and went to North Attleboro Public Schools along with all my siblings. I felt I got a great education from those, and that's what I would advocate for, is strong public schools. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Another question from the front, please.
As you probably know, Boston, Cambridge area is one of the most vulnerable places in the country in terms of storm surge and sea level rise when it comes to global warming. And while that may still seem off in the future, it feels to me like now is the time we need to really start thinking about it. And I wonder what role you feel the state should be playing now in terms of protecting the Boston area from climate change.
And what was your name?
Sorry, Rosalie.
Rosalie.
Okay, so we'll let Jay start
Okay.
this one and come back to you, Josh.
Protecting our environment is crucial, and that's why I was proud, based on my history, that the Sierra Club decided to endorse me. And this is a pressing issue. I used to live in a Micronesian island out in the Western Pacific, and saw the effects of climate change firsthand, which were much more dramatic there than I see along the Charles today, where there were reefs that were exposed for the first time in the memory of people, and they got burnt out, where there were, the tides were changing, the salination levels of the water were greatly increasing because it was right at the equator, and the fish that you were seeing around the island were changing, and it was happening within people's lifetime. The state can play an important role. One of the things that I like that the Cambridge City Council just did in approving some of the recent developments were requiring that the buildings be net zero, that they not use more energy, that they be energy efficient, and that the state can do things to encourage green energy. The state can encourage and should encourage greater use of non-fossil fuel in state buildings, and looking for alternative power in state buildings, and that can be done today. I would look for greater opportunities for the greening, first of the state, through the state facilities, because the state should be doing it first, and encouraging development, similar to what was just done in Cambridge, for making better use of our resources here in Boston and Cambridge. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay.
This district abuts the Charles River. The Esplanade is right out of my back window. Run on there almost every morning. I try every morning. But sea levels, especially they relate to this area, are very important, not just because we are Democrats, we're progressive Democrats that care about our environment, but also because a lot of homes in the Beacon Hill Back Bay area, I mean, think about the Back Bay. It's the ultimate development project. It was a marshland and a bay back in the 1860s until they invested in it. These homes are built on these, wooden beams that need to be submerged in water to ensure that they don't rot. And families have lost their homes because they've fallen because of the changing sea level. And we need to make sure that we're very mindful of that. But as it relates to how a state representative can affect this, one, investing in our transportation infrastructure. What can we do locally? We can get as many people out of their cars as possible by investing in our high-speed rail system, connecting Fall River to Greater Boston, connecting Western Massachusetts to New York and New Hampshire and Vermont, and making sure that people, if they would like to, because they want to work, live, and play in a relatively small area. If you look at property values from 2006 to 2011 in Greater Boston, those areas with those properties within a half a mile of a public transportation stop increased in value by about 129%. Outside of those areas, decreased on average in value. It's astonishing. Smart development, green development is good. It's good for our economy. It's good for our environment. And it's good for our policy in the State House. And as a state representative, I want to make sure I walked here from the Back Bay. We should be able to do that everywhere in Greater Boston. Get people off the roads.
Thank you. I see a couple of hands in the back. Let's start with this gentleman here.
Yes, my name is Richard O'Donnell, and I'm a resident of this building. We're happy to have the candidates come on behalf of the residents.
Thank you for having us.
Well, guess what? It's been very informative. I didn't know the two gentlemen too much before tonight, so now I know where they stand. My question specifically is, what are your positions on it's really the T budget, and specifically the T increases for the disabled who got a 100% increase. It's not a lot of money, but 100%. And I heard that you supported the governor's budget proposal, but I'd just like to get your positions on both of those issues.
We'll start with you, Josh, and go with Jay.
Well, Jay and I have a mutual friend. Her name is Mary Crozier. Mary lives in the Back Bay and loves the ride. She has about 3 doctor's appointments a month that she uses the ride for. And Mary told me that the ride doubled in price, I think, twice in the past couple of years. If we do not get the MBTA on stable financial footing, you could see that increase in the next year or two. People who are living on fixed income can least afford a higher sales tax and a higher cost for the MBTA. And people earning a living right now, people young in their careers like I am not afraid for more of my paycheck to go to support services like that. And I think a lot of folks I know aren't afraid. We need to invest in our public transportation system. And Richard, I'm glad you brought that up. If we do not get the MBTA funding on stable funding, folks like you who use the ride and those services, and folks like me who my Charlie card and my Zip card membership's how I gotten around town for the past 7 years. It's only going to get more expensive. However, if we can make sure that maybe it's a 5% increase every year, people living on fixed incomes might be able to predict that and work with that on a day-to-day basis. But when it's double digits, every year or two, that's tough for folks, and I understand that.
Thank you. Jay.
I think public transportation is crucial, and making sure that everyone can get around in our community is even more essential. Mary is a great example of that. My campaign chair, Fran Burke, is 84 and used the ride extensively and also talked about the doubling of price. People, and that's wrong. And what I liked about the governor's proposal was that it paid for the transportation infrastructure we need in a progressive manner. The people who could afford to pay the most did. The people who couldn't pay more don't. The latest proposals are going to rely on fare increases. And that's going to impact, that's a regressive way to raise revenue. And that's not what I would want to push. That's not what I would want to be voting. So, and in particular, the transportation infrastructure is crucial because not only is it essential for everyone to get around, but with all the proposals to develop that are going on, all the new residential buildings that are going on in this neighborhood and in Back Bay and in the West End are only going to bring more people to this area that's already congested. And so we have to make sure that we have the infrastructure to support that and to allow everyone to get around and have a great quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Next question in the back on my left.
Hi, I'm Kathy Zusi. I'm a member of the Cambridgeport Neighborhood Association, and we're working to revitalize Magazine Beach, a 15-acre park, state park along the Charles River that's in very derelict condition and under the jurisdiction of the very underfunded Department of Conservation and Recreation. As our new state rep, how will you work with us to encourage improvements and to advocate for the better care of all of our state parks? They allow us to vacation in our own backyard and provide us with access to nature.
All right. We'll start with you, Jay.
Thank you. We live in a great area. I love walking around Cambridgeport and knocking on doors because of all the parks. I love living in Boston and running and riding my bike along the Charles River, especially at sunset. And it's beautiful, and we need to make sure to take care of it. And Marty Walls was a great advocate on this issue. And I saw her work firsthand when she was helping people like me. When I served, and I'm currently serving, as a board member of the Beacon Hill Civic Association. And I'm the clerk of the Zoning and Licensing Committee. And on the Civic Association board, when we wanted to do things in the neighborhood and wanted to get help, wanted somebody to lean on a federal agency or a state agency to help us get improvements in the neighborhood, like you're working on for Magazine Breach. And I think that's great. Marty was the one that stood with us. And I saw how effective that was in helping me and the Civic Association. And I would want to be the same type of advocate for Cambridge and for Boston that I saw the last few years, to make sure that our neighborhoods, which we love to live in, not only do we get to preserve the parks that we have, but improve them and make them what they should be. Thank you.
Thank you. Josh?
What makes the 8th Suffolk one of the best districts probably in the country is the aesthetics of it. I mean, you're talking West End, Beacon Hill, Back Bay, Cambridgeport. I mean, it's some of the most beautiful areas I've ever seen. In college, I studied for a semester at the Sorbonne in Paris and lived right next to the Luxembourg Gardens there. And the first time I visited Boston back in college, back in 2002, right around there, I remember seeing the Commonwealth Mall, and I said, wow, that reminds me of the boulevards of Paris. And we have parklands in this district that are unlike anything in the world. I proposed to my wife in the public garden. I'm probably not the only person that's done that before. Lindsay and I ride our bikes. We run along the Esplanade. Our public spaces make this one of the best places in which to live, work, and raise your family. And I will be unwavering in my commitment to make sure the aesthetics of our neighborhoods are world class.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question, and I saw this hand first. So you get to have the last audience question. My
You
apologies.
mentioned how education reform was a work in progress, but healthcare reform also seems to be very much a work in progress. And we were supposed to address two issues, access and cost control. So what would you do to continue moving that work forward in terms of healthcare access and cost control?
All right, so we will start with you, Josh.
Many of my former colleagues, are, especially in Senator Richard Moore's office, are still trying to work this problem out. I'm a fan of the single payer proposal in Massachusetts. I think it's a great start. I'm not an expert in healthcare, but access to high quality healthcare in the institutions that are world class in our neighborhoods is, something I will fight for, and I would love to work. I don't have a great answer for this one, but I would love to work with you on trying to make this happen. Thank you.
Okay. Jay?
I think it's essential that we provide health care to everybody and that it's affordable. I support single payer. And one of the things that really surprised me was several years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine who owns a small business and whose healthcare costs tripled in a 2-year period, such that he was having to make decisions on whether or not he could keep the employees that he had working. Healthcare costs shouldn't be driving business decisions that much. And I'm proud that that Massachusetts first led the way on healthcare, trying to start to set a basic system to make it more affordable for everybody. And it now is working on cost containment. Rob Whitney I'd love to talk to him. He lives in the neighborhood. He's on the Beacon Hill Civic Association board with me. He's on Ward 5 committee with Josh and I. And every time I talk to him, he's more excited about the regulations and the different ways that the governor is trying to look at, and the government is trying to look at exploring cost containment. And no one has found the exact answer yet, but I think that it's an essential issue that we have to deal with, because too much of our economic spending is going towards healthcare. And first offering a single payer is one way to decrease the cost, but then also looking at the specific costs of services more closely is just as important. And I would do both as a state legislator. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. It's been really interesting to hear all the answers to the questions. I see our ward chair coming up. So before we end, of course, we want to hear one last bit from each of you. So we have 1 minute for each of you to give us a closing statement. We began with Josh, so we will begin this with Jay. You have a minute to seal the deal, make your case, tell us why we should be with you, and leave us with something important to remember before we go to the polls. So start with you, Jay.
Thank you. Well, thank you again for having me tonight. And I would be honored to have your vote on May 28th. It's the day after Memorial Day, as I say 85 times a day, at least. And the reason I'm running is, like I said in the beginning, is I want to make a difference. And why I want to make it, how I want to make a difference is stronger public schools, so that every kid in Massachusetts gets the education they deserve. Restoring money to social programs, so that other prosecutors don't see the kids slipping through the cracks like I saw. Improving our transportation infrastructure throughout the region, so that we have the economic growth that we deserve. And smart development. Making sure that development is essential. And we need to make sure that it happens in a way that doesn't change the character of our great neighborhoods. Thank you, and I would be honored to have your vote on May 28th.
Thank you. For you.
Laura, thanks for everything. This is a great evening. Everyone in attendance, thanks for coming. For folks watching at home, my name is Josh Dawson. I also would be honored to have your vote on May 28th, Tuesday, May 28th. Polls are open from 7 a.m. until 8 p.m. I moved here with $721 in my pocket. I didn't have a job, and I've worked my way up to just now recently being the executive director for State Treasurer Steve Grossman. It's very humbling, and it's still surreal to know that I believe I am in a position to win this election. I believe I'm the strongest candidate in this race because my experience working in the legislature, hands-on progressive legislation that I helped pass that not only had local impact, but national impact implications. I'd be honored to have your vote so that we continue to work together to make Greater Boston the best place in which to live, work, raise a family, and educate our children. Thank you so much. Again, Josh Dawson, D-A-W-S-O-N. I'm first on the ballot. Thanks for your time. Thank you.